You know that feeling when you're explaining something you understand deeply, and halfway through you realize the other person stopped listening 3 sentences ago? Not because they're rude, not because you're boring, but because somewhere in that gap between what you know and what they're ready to hear, the connection just dissolved. Most of us have been on both sides of that moment, and when it happens, we tend to think it says something about intelligence, about who's smart and who isn't, about fixed capacity. But what if that moment has nothing to do with intelligence at all, and everything to do with how our minds have been trained to work? We've been told for most of our lives that some people are just naturally smarter, that intelligence is something you're born with, a genetic lottery that plays out in test scores and career trajectories. The kid who breezes through calculus while everyone else struggles, the friend who reads once and remembers forever. We watch them and think they just have it. And maybe you've been on the other side too, working twice as hard for half the recognition, feeling like your brain moves differently, slower maybe, or just in directions no one seems to value. Here's what's rarely said out loud. The entire framework is wrong. For decades, psychologists treated intelligence like height. You measure it once, you know what you're working with, end of story. Alfred Binet created the first IQ test in 1905, and while his intentions were actually compassionate, he wanted to identify children who needed extra help, the test became something else entirely. It became a label, a limit, a finished sentence about who someone could become. But in the late 20th century, researchers started noticing something strange. People's cognitive abilities weren't nearly as fixed as everyone assumed. Students who struggled in rigid academic environments would flourish when the learning structure changed. Adults who believed they were bad at math could develop genuine skill with different teaching methods. The brain, it turned out, wasn't a static organ with a set processing speed. It was adaptive, responsive, trainable. This wasn't just optimistic thinking, this was neuroscience. Carol Dweck's research at Stanford revealed something that should have overhauled our entire education system. She found that students who believed intelligence could be developed, what she called a growth mindset, didn't just feel better about themselves, they actually performed better. Not because they were smarter to begin with, but because their beliefs changed how they approached difficulty. When they hit a wall, they didn't see a limit, they saw a problem worth solving. Meanwhile, students with equal ability who believed intelligence was fixed would avoid challenges, give up faster, and plateau earlier. Same brain, different training. The difference wasn't in the hardware, it was in how the mind had learned to interpret struggle. Think about that for a second. Two people with identical cognitive potential can end up in completely different places, not because one is inherently smarter, but because one learned to treat confusion as interesting and the other learned to treat it as proof of inadequacy. That's not intelligence, that's conditioning. And here's where it gets deeper. When neuroscientists started studying the brains of people engaged in deliberate learning, they found something remarkable. The brain physically changes in response to how we use it. This process, called neuroplasticity, means that every time you struggle with something and push through, you're not just learning a skill, you're rewiring the architecture of your mind. New neural connections form, existing pathways strengthen, the brain becomes more efficient at tasks it practices. London taxi drivers, for instance, develop larger hippocampi, the brain region involved in spatial memory, after years of navigating complex city streets. Musicians show enhanced connectivity between brain regions that control movement and sound. These aren't genetic gifts, they're the result of repeated, effortful engagement. The mind trains itself through use, and the way you use it determines what it becomes good at. But here's what makes this complicated. Our culture worships the appearance of effortless genius. We celebrate the prodigy, the savant, the person who makes it look easy. We've built an entire mythology around natural talent, and in doing so, we've made struggle look like failure. So when someone works hard to understand something, we assume they're compensating for a lack of ability. When someone learns quickly, we assume they're just smart. We've mistaken ease for intelligence and effort for inadequacy. This does something cruel.
It makes people hide their learning process. It makes them feel shame about not knowing, and worse, it prevents them from doing the very thing that would actually develop their intelligence, engaging with difficulty. Because here's the truth no one wants to hear. Geniuses aren't people who never struggle, they're people who've learned to struggle effectively. They've trained their minds to stay curious when things get confusing, to ask better questions instead of retreating, to treat mistakes as information rather than identity. This isn't about being smarter, it's about having a different relationship with not knowing. Take Richard Feynman, the physicist who won a Nobel Prize and spent his entire career making complex ideas accessible. He wasn't just brilliant, he was relentlessly curious. He approached problems by asking what seemed like childishly simple questions, breaking everything down to first principles, rebuilding understanding from the ground up. His genius wasn't in having all the answers, it was in how he trained himself to think when he didn't. Or consider how ancient Greek philosophers approached knowledge. Socrates built his entire method around admitting ignorance. His famous claim, "I know that I know nothing," wasn't humility for humility's sake, it was a cognitive strategy. By starting from a place of not knowing, he freed his mind to explore without the burden of defending existing beliefs. He trained his intelligence by making space for it to move. This is what modern psychology is finally catching up to. Intelligence isn't a fixed quantity, it's a process, a set of habits, a way of directing attention. And you can train it. So here's the question worth sitting with. How do you currently respond when you don't understand something? Do you get curious or do you get defensive? Do you lean in or do you shut down? There's no judgment in asking this. We all have patterns we've inherited. Maybe you grew up in a school system that punished wrong answers. Maybe you had a parent who valued being right over being honest. Maybe you've just absorbed the cultural message that smart people know things instantly and everyone else is faking it. But wherever those patterns came from, they're not permanent. You're not stuck with the mind you have right now. You're only stuck if you believe you are. There's a distinction worth making here, though. Training your mind isn't the same as obsessively optimizing yourself. It's not about productivity hacks or forcing yourself through misery in the name of self-improvement. That's just another kind of rigidity. Real cognitive development happens when you're genuinely engaged, when you're curious, when the challenge feels meaningful, not like a test you're trying to pass. The difference between healthy learning and compulsive striving is whether you're moving towards something that matters to you or away from a feeling of inadequacy. One expands you, the other just exhausts you. What we're really talking about is this. Intelligence is less about what you know and more about how you relate to what you don't know. It's about training yourself to stay present with confusion, to get comfortable with the feeling of your brain working, to trust that understanding builds slowly through attention and patience, not through some magical moment of clarity that either happens or doesn't. The most intelligent people aren't the ones who never feel lost, they're the ones who've trained themselves to navigate being lost without panicking. They've learned that the mind grows in the direction you point it, and they've pointed theirs towards questions, not conclusions. This changes everything. It means you're not limited by the brain you were born with, you're only limited by how you've learned to use it. And that can change today, right now, in the next conversation you have, in the next problem you face. You don't need to be a genius, you just need to train your mind like one. And maybe that's the real insight here. Genius isn't a person, it's a practice, a way of thinking that anyone can learn if they're willing to treat their mind not as a fixed tool, but as something alive, something that responds. If this resonates, the next video explores how the most creative minds use boredom to think differently, not in the motivational sense, but in the psychological one. How they've trained themselves to find insight in emptiness. It's a continuation of what we've started here, worth watching when you're ready.